Chapter 2: Indigenous Africa as a Cultivating Ground for Arab Islam. Introduction. The main focus of this chapter is an analysis of the interaction between the Arab Islamic tradition and the indigenous Black African environment during the early phase of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa, that is, the interaction between the incoming Arab Islamic tradition and the host indigenous African socio-religious and political environment before the 18th and 19th centuries. We shall examine this interaction by analyzing some underlying currents of the history of Islam in Africa in order to show the dynamics involved in the conversion of Africans to Islam. This will involve the examination of the activities of early Muslim groups in their interaction with indigenous African communities. These Muslim groups include traders and religious professionals known as holy men and/or clerics, widely regarded as heralds of the Arab Islamic dispensation in Black Africa. We shall begin by briefly highlighting the activities of these heralds as far as they relate to the diffusion of Islam. We will then look at the status of these Muslim groups within the traditional Black African environment and its implication for conversion to Islam. This will be done by highlighting the mechanisms that underlie the relationship, ensure the preservation of Arab Islam, and facilitated and/or debilitated its diffusion within tropical Africa. The introduction of Islam to tropical Africa. Long before the advent of Islam, in about 610 CE in Arabia, present-day North and Northeast Africa had already been under considerable religious, military, political, and commercial influence from such successive ancient powers as the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Vandals, and Christian Byzantium. The Phoenicians are said to have been in direct touch with Africans south of the Sahara. Great cities such as Carthage, founded by the Phoenicians in about 814 BCE, and Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, became centers of great civilizations. The first major Muslim impact in Africa followed the invasion by Arab Muslim armies of Egypt in 638 CE. Plagued by sectarian rivalries between Byzantine and other Christian groups of North Africa regarded as heretics, Coptic Egypt offered little resistance and capitulated in 644 CE to Arab Muslim armies that then launched a series of campaigns to capture the rest of North Africa. It was not, however, until the 11th century that the Berbers, Imazighen, of present-day North Africa were subdued by the Arabs after many bloody feuds. An Arab governor of the time, speaking about Berber resistance, is reported to have said in exasperation that the conquest of Africa is impossible. Scarcely has one Berber tribe been exterminated than another takes its place. Nonetheless, Arab Islamic civilization was destined to gain control over North Africa after that of Punic, Greek, Roman, and Judeo-Christian civilizations. The tradition of militant Islamization was taken over by the Sanhaja, veiled Berbers, who came under the influence of the Murabitun, Al-Moravid movement, founded by Abdallah bin Yassin, who died in 1059, early in the 11th century. The movement employed Islam as a unifying tool for Sanhaja solidarity and conducted raids into the Sahel, the shore of the desert, which allegedly led to the conquest, or rather weakening, of ancient Ghana in 1076. To the southern and northeastern parts of the Sudan, this initial militant surge of invading Arab Berber Muslim armies suffered serious setbacks at the hands of the African kingdoms of Makuria and Ethiopia. A prophetic tradition was later adduced to the effect that the Abyssinians, or Ethiopians, should be left alone, and relations with northern Nubia normalized through an agreement known as the Bact, which allowed subjects of each side the right to travel and trade unhindered in the other's domains. This agreement lasted for about 7 centuries, until the might of Mamluk Egypt finally overwhelmed Christian Nubia around 1371 CE, rendering the terms of the pact null and void. A huge cathedral in Dongola, Sudan, was converted into a mosque, signaling the beginning of the end of the long tradition of Christianity in North Africa and the Sudan. There ensued a series of sporadic raids into the region of sub-Saharan Africa, Bilad al-Sudan, mainly with the aim of acquiring slaves, with little or no intention to convert the indigenous people. The heralds of Arab Islam in tropical Africa. It is generally agreed among scholars that the introduction of Islam into Black Africa was due to the activities of Muslim traders and religious experts. the trans-Saharan trade route that ran throughout tropical Africa, North Africa, and the Mediterranean into Europe, and across the Red Sea into Arabia and the Middle East, long in existence before the advent of Islam, received a special Islamic stamp and impetus after the Muslim conquest of North Africa and subsequent control of the trade routes. The Berbers, after their subjugation by the Arabs, not only accepted Islam, but a good number of them also took the mercantile profession of their Arab overlords, becoming principal Muslim traders among the Soninke of ancient Ghana as early as the 8th century. The Soninke in turn introduced long-distance trade and Islam further south of the Sahara, where they became variously known as Serakule in the Senegambian region and Maka in the Middle Niger area. A significant minority of the Malinke or Mande peoples of ancient Mali and Songhai took to long-distance trade, which resulted in their dispersion around the 14th century throughout the savanna zones of West Africa up to the fringes of the forest belt of the Gulf of Guinea. They became known as the Dafin in the Upper Black Volta, Dayula, which literally means trader, in the Upper Niger region, Yas, to the Mul Dagbani-speaking peoples, and Wangara in the Hausa Yoruba lands. The Hausa and Yoruba picked up the mantle of Muslim long-distance trade and joined their Mande colleagues in the West African region. In the Horn and East African zone, Arab and Persian Muslim seafarers came via the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean and established a string of trading posts along the shores and the islands off the coast as early as the 7th century. The merchants tended, over the course of time, to settle more permanently, usually as local aristocracies, and took local women as concubines. The blending with local blood and culture produced Arab Islamic-inspired cultures, such as the Shirazi, Persian-inspired, the Zailwawi, a blending of Arab, Somali, and Afar elements, and the Swahili, a mixture of Arab and Bantu traits. Arab and Swahili traders are said to have penetrated the interior of Zimbabwe by the 10th century. These had a boost in their commercial activities as a result of the high demand for slaves and ivory on the coast by the 19th century. Here in East and Central Africa, African communities such as the Afar of Somalia, the Yawa of Tanzania and Malawi, and many other individual converts from the Nyamwezi and Ganda came into contact with Islam through the activities of early Arab and Swahili traders. Muslim trading communities in their dispersion throughout tropical Africa always went with professional men of religion who, by virtue of their literacy in the Arabic script and expertise in Islamic law and rituals, acted as religious guides, prayer leaders, teachers and healers, mainly for the community. The initial movement and dispersion of these religious professionals, therefore, was very much dependent on the travels and settlements of the Muslim trading communities, whose own dispersion and settlement, for reasons that will shortly become apparent, were dependent on political centers of influence. Most of these experts were believed to have knowledge not only in the exoteric sciences of Islam, Ilm al-Zahir, which falls under the Islamic law or fiqh, but also in the esoteric sciences, Ilm al-Batin, which come under Islamic mysticism, Tasawwuf. The Shurafa, from the Arabic Sharif, noble, who claimed descent from the Quraysh, Muhammad's tribe, were believed to have an inherited piety and holiness, which in turn conferred on them powers of healing, telling the future, interpreting dreams, and effective intercessory prayers, dua. They became the most successful manufacturers of charms and the most successful practitioners of Islamic divination and medicine among the masses of West Africa. In the Horn and along the eastern coast of Africa, immigrant Muslim divines established Jama'at, semi-detached religious communities that developed by offering prospects of stable livelihood to dispossessed peoples of servile origins and serving as sanctuaries for offenders fleeing from their own clans and families. The Qadiriya Sufi order, founded by Abd al-Qadir al-Jilani, 1077 to 1166, is the oldest tariqa to be established in Hara in East Africa from Aden by one Abu Bakr ibn Abdullah al-Aidarus, died 1503. Other Turuk, such as Salihia, founded by Muhammad Salih of Arabia with a popular appeal within peasant circles in Somaliland, the Sadiliya, Husseiniya, Ahmadiyya, and many others also made some impression. In West Africa, the Kunta, under the celebrated leadership of one Sidi Ahmad al-Bakai, died 1515, introduced the Qadiriya word, where it was later popularized in the 19th century under the leadership of Sidi al-Mukhtar al-Kabir al-Kunti, died 1811. Tuareg Muslim religious professionals, such as the Sanhaja, Zawaya, from the Arabic Zawiya, literally meaning a corner for religious activities, and other Mauritanian groups, had a considerable influence in the Senegambian region of West Africa, where they established Islamic Jama'at in the villages. Black African Muslim divines in this category, popularly referred to in modern discourse as clerics or marabouts, had various local appellations. These include Mwalimu in Swahili, Wadad in Somali, Malam in Hausa, Karamoko in Malinke, Alpha in Songhai, Cherno in Tukulor, Modibo in Fulani, Sereni or Serine in Wolof, etc. These appellations all carry the connotation of someone who is literate in the Arabic script. Malam and Mwalimu are both from the Arabic Mu'alim, which literally means teacher, while Karamoko is from the Arabic Kara'a, which means to read, to be literate. These indigenous Muslim religious professionals, both as individuals and organized communities, are well known throughout Muslim Africa as being the principal contributors to the spread of Islam through their provision of charms, amulets, and prayers for various purposes. The Jakhane, a well-known organized group of this tradition, is said to have been founded by a 12th century Mande Muslim, alim, scholar, by the name Al-Hajj Salim Suare. The Jakhane tradition is known to be a highly pacifist Muslim group responsible for inculcating a sense of aversion to militancy as a means of religious and political change into a wider section of West African Muslims, especially the Mande. They are chiefly associated with the pursuance of religious study, the production of charms and amulets, travel, sometimes for commercial purposes, and agricultural cultivation, through which they made their most significant and enduring impact upon the wider indigenous non-Muslim communities. Their contribution to the spread of Islam in West and Central Africa, especially among the Mande people groups, is well documented by Lamine Sané in the Jakhane. It was not, however, until the 19th and 20th centuries that organized Islamic mysticism, or Sufism, under indigenous African leadership, made a considerable impact in the diffusion of Islam in tropical Africa. There are those who think that the introduction of Islam was mainly the work of traders and trade, and those who take the view that trade played very little part in the introduction of Islam, and that missionaries of Islam in West Africa were clerics, not traders. With regard to the role of Muslim trading activities in the spread of Islam in tropical Africa, the following are the most important factors. First, Muslim trade in tropical Africa developed in commercial networks, especially dependent on some common factors or interests such as kinship, common neighborhood of origin, or religious brotherhood. Trading alliances among the Dayula, for instance, developed largely along family or clan lines, Kabila, marriage, study mates, or Hajj mates, i.e., those who performed the pilgrimage to Mecca in the same year. These networks were bound together by these alliances. The trading units provided the beginner with his first capital, or credit, and assured the established wholesaler of his outlets. Murray Last writes in this regard, Hausa trade is essentially dependent on networks. Growth depends on the number of trading friends, not on the cheapness of one's wares, and the number of new customers one can thus attract. Friends are those to whom one gives goods on credit. In effect, those to whom you can give capital. Thus, one has to share one or more of the alliances, of which Islam was paramount, in order to engage successfully in long-distance trade. In fact, this writer knows a considerable number of relatives and friends in the upper regions of Ghana who converted to Islam in order to participate in long-distance kola nut and cattle trade. Such long-distance ventures have therefore virtually become no-go areas for non-Muslims, not necessarily out of any deliberate effort on the part of Muslims to Islamize and therefore monopolize it, even though deliberate monopolizing also cannot be ruled out completely, but due to the sheer intricacies of the networks. Second, the lifestyles of Muslim merchants in the forms of dressing and the textiles they introduced into indigenous Africa impressed many Africans. Imitation of Muslim ways of dressing, seen more as a higher level of social standing, gradually ended up in conversions. Hence, Islam in tropical Africa, as in Southeast Asia, developed almost entirely along the trade routes of Central and Western Sudan, and the coastal trading centers of East Africa. In most areas of pre-European Africa, the distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim almost always corresponded to urban-rural or trader-peasant divide, which of course did not necessarily mean there were no rural peasant Muslims or urban non-Muslim dwellers. Nevertheless, the link was so strong that, for instance, in West Africa the term diula is synonymous to trader and Muslim, while in southern Ethiopia the term nagadi, trader, became the universal term for Muslim. The third area is that of the economic contributions of Muslim traders to the cause of Islam. A local Muslim teacher in Ethiopia intimated that by financing the building of mosques, funding pilgrimages to Mecca, purchasing religious texts for the teachers, etc., the traders were the patrons of the propagation of Islam in Ethiopia. As far as the Muslim divines are concerned, the main aim of their dispersion, as we have intimated above, was to act as guides and teachers to already existing Muslim communities. The Dayula, Karamoko, in particular, saw themselves as guardians of the Sunnah and regarded their leadership roles within the society as mainly concerned with the Muwaza, social and moral guidance. It was in their principal role as guardians of the Sunnah that the Karamoko helped in preserving intact the Islamic content of their culture, and through that exercised profound leadership influence upon the wider non-Muslim communities. The art of literacy in the largely non-literate indigenous African milieu gave Muslim divines special secular roles as secretaries and recorders in traditional courts. Traditional Africans generally viewed literacy with a sense of reverent awe and mystery that made the religious arts of divination and the production of amulets and talismans by Muslim divines very desirable in the wider society at large, and the traditional courts in particular. This literary magic, as Goody calls it, gave Muslim divines unique economic, social, religious, and political status within the communities. This was mainly due to their prayers and production of Islamic charms, which were and still are regarded throughout tropical Africa as having special potency to heal, prevent sickness, or assuage misfortune, to reduce luck, ensure victory in wars, etc. Muslim arts of divination were particularly sought in times of war, in order to know the propitious time to attack. Prayers sought to win battles, war coats and hats produced, stitched with leather safis or silvered amulets of Quranic verses, to paralyze the enemy's hand, shiver his weapons and divert their courses. Writing on the crucial role of Muslim divinations, prayers, charms, and amulets in times of war, a Muslim teacher wrote that, actually, if you want to wage war and you do not find the malam, it is impossible for you to do so. These services are what mainly account for early Islamic influence on the traditional courts of the Western Sudan, whence Muslims exerted their sphere of influence. Muslim influence in Ashanti and the Ashanti relationship with the northern kingdoms of Gonja, Dangomba, Nanumba, and Mamprusi mainly centered around the fact that the kings of Ashanti valued the religious and ritual services of Muslims from the north in exchange for allowing Muslim traders access to gold and kola markets that were the preserve of the Ashanti. In East Africa, to take another example, a 19th century missionary gave an account of one Bana Osman, a Mohammedan of Zanzibar, who fills the office of king's physician, chief magician, and court jester, and whose duty it was to compose powerful talismans against Kisuma, presumably a rival, chief of Mafe. However, while the role played by the religious professionals was crucial in preserving the Islamic culture among the existing Muslim communities, for reasons that will be made clear in the next section, the acquisition of these elements did not necessarily result in conversions of indigenous communities. As far as the vast majority were concerned, Consultana Karamogao did not in any way mean conversion to Islam. It did represent the willingness to test the efficacy of Islamic specialists. The main difficulty relating to attempts to distinguish the various roles played by Muslim traders and religious professionals in the diffusion of Islam in tropical Africa is that these two activities are often associated in Muslim communities and regularly combined in the same person. Muslim traders and religious men hardly saw their activities as mutually exclusive. As families, clans, ethnic and/or religious communities, Muslim traders and religious men saw their activities as complementary rather than competitive, as the former used their wealth to support the latter, and the latter use their knowledge and influence in the interest of the former. What is even more important, perhaps, is that neither Muslim traders nor religious professionals at this stage consider themselves or their activities as missionary. Conversions to Islam associated with their activities were by and large indirect and incidental. Mervyn Hiskett observes in relation to Arab and Swahili traders of East Africa that the saving of souls was a byproduct of the quest for gold, albeit an effective byproduct. This observation, in a general sense, applies to the activities of both Muslim traders and religious professionals in tropical Africa. The above analysis does not suggest that Islam lacked an intrinsic religious appeal. What it does, though, is to draw attention to the dynamics of the process of conversion in Africa in general and African conversion to Islam in particular. In this connection, prevailing discourses on the issue have tended to focus on the role of the incoming tradition of Islam and that of Muslim agents, with little or no attention given to the host indigenous African factor. The general theme in the discussion of conversion to Islam in Africa has been that the host traditional environment was a passive partner, while the incoming tradition of Islam brought the vital cohesive element into the interaction. The traditional African social, religious, and political environment has therefore been treated as an object and hardly as a subject of conversion to Islam in Africa. The dynamics of basic and fundamental indigenous African conceptions of religion and other related factors, and how these affected the process of religious change in the interaction between the incoming traditions of Islam and Christianity and the host indigenous traditions of Africa, has not been taken into account. It is these basic and fundamental factors, and how they facilitated and or debilitated the preservation and propagation of the incoming tradition of Arab Islam, that we proceed to examine. The indigenous African environment and conversion to Islam. Conversion to Islam in Africa. Some observations. Since the 19th century, the issue of religious change or conversion in tropical Africa has received much attention from various scholars, both Western and African, of religion and social anthropology. The issues with which these scholars occupied themselves were the underlying factors for conversion or lack of conversion of black Africans to Christianity and Islam. Many theories emerged as the discussion was in the main championed by Christian missionaries who tended to compare the expansion of Islam with Christianity. Their conviction of the spontaneous appeal of Christianity seems to have been shaken by the lack of mass conversions of Africans. In their bid to explain the progress Islam had made on some communities at the time, the dominant theory in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was that the African is by nature unable to grasp metaphysical issues. As such, being a sensual and materialistic religion, which required little or no intellectual sophistication, Islam suited the African's egocentric and less sophisticated mind. People like Edward Blyden, widely acclaimed at the time as a sympathetic advocate of African identity and the Islamic tradition, wrote that Islam is no doubt better suited to the intellectual comprehension of a people steeped in ignorance and heathenism. Other more recent theories with regard to religious change as specifically related to Islam in tropical Africa include arguments that the representatives of Islam, in contrast to Christianity, were Africans themselves who made the Arab Islamic tradition amenable to their compatriots. Not a few scholars have since tried to look for some similarities and coincidences between Islam and the traditional African religious thought as possible explanations for African conversion to Islam. Ali Mazuri, for instance, argues, among other things, that Islam is an African religion because indigenous Africans carried the banner of Islam, and that, unlike Christianity, Islam has a lot of similarities with the traditional African worldview, making it less difficult for Africans to convert to Islam. A related argument to explain African conversion to Islam is that Islam is more tolerant, accommodating, and flexible to traditional African socio-religious values. Writing extensively on the coincidences and similarities between Islam and traditional African cosmology, I.M. Lewis talks about the generous Catholicity of Islam toward traditional African values. In addition to some basic difficulties related to the theories of the African identity of the heralds of Islam in Africa and the generous Catholicity of Islam toward African values, which will be made apparent later in this chapter, There are two fundamental assumptions that have beset the discussion of conversion in tropical Africa with specific reference to Islam. The first is the focus on the incoming tradition of Islam and Christianity as the main, if not sole, determinant of conversion, with little or no attention paid to the host traditional African environment. This assumption is further based on another unstated related assumption that the host indigenous African traditions were always displaced by the incoming Islamic or Christian traditions whenever the two encountered each other. S.S. Nyang, for instance, speaks of the adoption of Islam in Africa as having displaced an indigenous belief system. We shall address these assumptions in later parts of this chapter and the next. However, suffice it to say now that these assumptions are in a sense rooted in the ancient competition between Islam and Christianity, a competition that in no small way contributed to the dismissive attitude toward the host indigenous traditions. The only role given to the host indigenous traditions in this procedure is that of passive recipients and objects of change, with little or no resilience in the face of alien traditions. As cogently stated by Lamine Sané, though, the past procedure upon which Islam has achieved the double victory of successful conversion and of generosity towards African values is a contradictory state of affairs that clearly discredits the procedure. The imputing of Islam of a wide degree of flexibility in its interaction with African societies completes the process by robbing traditional societies of crucial elements of their heritage, namely the tradition of enclavement, which accords protection and guarantee to stranger and non-kin groups on one hand, and on the other, the inclusive and tenacious nature of local religions. It is this tradition of enclavement and the inclusive and tenacious nature of the indigenous environment that we now proceed to highlight in order to examine the relationship between early Muslim communities and indigenous African societies, to show how the relations not only facilitated and or debilitated conversion to Islam before the jihad and colonial periods, but also determined the direction and content of the social-religious exchanges. The second assumption is that the issue of conversion or religious change in tropical Africa in the discussion of most scholars has almost always been centered around the coming into awareness of a proper conception of the supreme being. In other words, conversion of Africans to the so-called monotheistic religions of Islam and Christianity is always seen as Africans coming to a proper, if not first-time awareness of and relationship with the supreme being. Tied up with this assumption of the conception of a supreme being as a philosophical concept expressed in a set of doctrines or creeds subject to elaboration in epistemological terms. Hence, people like Emil Ludwig were surprised as to how the untutored African could conceive God, a philosophical concept which savages are incapable of framing. Many leading African scholars such as E. Bolaji Idowu and J. S. Mbiti have endeavored to demonstrate that before Islam or Christianity emerged in Africa, Africans knew God and related to Him in their own ways. A famous Akan proverb that states that nobody teaches a child about God is often cited to underline the pervasive and almost intuitive awareness of the Supreme Being by Africans. The assumption that conversion in Africa is a coming into awareness of the Supreme Being has in no small way vitiated many discussions on the issue, as we shall shortly demonstrate. The association of African conversion with the coming into awareness of the Supreme Being is particularly evident in the debate on religious change in tropical Africa between Robert Horton and H. J. Fisher. Horton's thesis is particularly intriguing in that in his discussion, he does not assume traditional Africa as a passive object of religious change, but an active subject of the process. Horton argues on the basis of a two-tier structure of what he calls the basic African cosmology, made up of the world of the lesser spirits, which underpin events of the local community, i.e. the microcosm, and the world of the supreme being that underpins events in the world at large, the macrocosm. On this basis, Horton suggests that the belief in the supreme being, conversion, in tropical Africa came about as a result of the development of traditional African religious thought under the stimulation of developments such as long-distance trade, etc., which were brought about by the advent of Islam and Christianity, but which were not in themselves expressions of the missionary concern of either faith. The role played by Islam and Christianity in this process, Horton argues, is that of catalysts, stimulators, accelerators, of changes which were in the air anyway. As far as Horton is concerned, The indigenous African environment was the principal determining factor in the process and resulting configuration of the changes. However, apart from the obvious difficulties in this thesis pointed out by numerous critics, such as the mechanical fashion in which it assumes a religious conversion in Africa to have taken place, his arguments are nevertheless based on the assumption that conversion or religious change is a belief in or coming to awareness of the Supreme Being. Belief in the Supreme Being is no doubt the doctrinal cornerstone of the so-called monotheistic religions of Islam and Christianity. This is even more so with Islam, where numerous prophetic traditions and doctrinal expositions declare that in the mere confession of the unity of God, Tawheed, is enough to make one a Muslim in at least the technical sense of conversion. However, as will be made apparent as we proceed, the dynamics of conversion to Islam and Christianity in Africa, and one would suppose other parts of the world, involved and still involve more than the profession of a belief in the Supreme Being. What is even more curious about Horton's hypothesis is that while insistent, and rightly so, in attributing an active role to the indigenous environment, he attributes generosity and flexibility to the incoming accommodated tradition of Islam rather than the host and dominant indigenous environment. H. J. Fisher, on his part, focuses on the incoming missionary traditions of Islam and Christianity as the principal determining factors of religious conversion in Africa. Fisher points out that Horton has exaggerated the potential of traditional religious thought and underrated the role played by missionary Islam and Christianity in bringing about religious change in Africa. Fisher rightly points out that Horton's mechanical theory does not explain why in many areas in Africa what Horton calls the microcosm still holds sway, even though these areas have been in contact with long-distance trade and the nation-state system for a considerable length of time. Fisher goes on to discount Horton's thesis on the grounds that for progress to be carried over from one leap forward to the next, literacy is necessary, albeit without any explanation as to why and how this is so. The implication of Fisher's argument is that since indigenous African traditions were non-literate, they could not develop a belief in the Supreme Being independent of missionary Islam and Christianity. This is strongly implied in his cogent and valid criticism of Horton's thesis, where he emphasizes the necessity of literacy in bringing about the development of the idea of the Supreme Being. Again, implicit in Fisher's argument of the role of literacy is the idea of a Supreme Being as a philosophical concept, which the non-literate or untutored African traditions cannot develop independently of the literate traditions of Islam and Christianity. Meanwhile, Fisher does not tell us how literacy has contributed in bringing about the development of the idea of the Supreme Being in either Christianity or Islam. Rather, he argues about the role literacy has played and continues to play in the preservation of what he calls the proper standards of the faith from being corrupted by local elements. It is important to remember also that the conception of religion in general, and the idea of the Supreme Being in particular, in epistemological or literary terms, is hardly sustainable when talking about the African understanding of religion in general and conversion to both Islam and Christianity in particular, as we shall demonstrate in the next section. Indeed, as G.C. Oosthuizen has observed, belief in Africa is not an epistemological issue. It is more a question of trust, more a matter of relationships than of propositions of logical arguments which predominate. Another point raised by Fisher on the importance of literacy is that non-literate traditions are less resilient in a pluralistic situation. In other words, the non-literate host indigenous African worldviews stood little or no chance when they came into contact with the literate Muslim and Christian traditions. According to Fisher, the orally transmitted African religions do not offer their adherents a framework within which to enter into a creative and resilient pluralism. The implication here is that in the encounter between indigenous African believers and the Muslim or Christian traditions, the former stood little chance of survival or were predisposed to indiscriminate borrowings, which does not even qualify to be termed syncretistic. The unformulated nature of the exchanges on the part of the indigenous traditions is the reason Fisher offers elsewhere for referring to the process as mixing rather than syncretism, which suggests rather more of a formulated, conscious combination of religions. The openness of indigenous traditions is what underlies Fisher's point here. However, he regards such openness as a sign of weakness and fragility, rather than strength and resilience, as most African scholars have done. For example, K.A. Opoku is of the opinion that, contrary to the impression that the spread of other religions in Africa is due to the palpably clear weakness of the host religion, it may be affirmed that the ability to accept truth outside one's own immediate environment and tradition is a sign of strength and maturity rather than its lamentable opposite. It is the interaction between the host indigenous traditions and the incoming tradition of Islam as it relates to conversion to the latter that we now proceed to examine. Muslims under indigenous patronage. Implications for conversion. As can be seen from the first part of this chapter, it was mainly in the diaspora that Muslim communities in tropical Africa, whether traders or clerics, retained a distinctive Islamic culture. The practice of Islam at this stage was found amongst itinerant rather than settled communities, and settled Muslim communities saw mobility as a way of strengthening their religious vocation. This is indicated by Lamin Saneh, who writes, "In the religious circles, the practice of retreat, Kalwa, and the theme of mobility, Safar, share a common history and a common purpose, which is to revitalize the religious spirit and set it in critical contrast to the alleged natural corruption of settled living." Saneh goes on to refer to medieval Sufi manuals in which being separated from one's native land, from friends and familiar things, and facing the challenges involved in a foreign land are as desirable and effective as nawafil, or super-retrogratory devotions, fasting and praying. This, of course, does not imply that Muslim groups in tropical Africa were deliberately dispersed to preserve and strengthen their faith. Rather, it is to emphasize the state of Islam and the identities of Muslim communities throughout most parts of Black Africa at this stage. The general status of Muslim communities throughout most parts of Africa is that as dispersed communities, they always found themselves not only as minorities in the midst of an overwhelming non-Muslim majority, but also as non-kin groups, strangers, in an indigenous environment. The first time a Muslim minority found itself in this situation, if we are to believe Muslim traditions, goes back to the time of the Prophet of Islam, when he advised over 80 male adults and their families of his followers to seek asylum in Abyssinia, Ethiopia, in 615 CE, i.e., the first hijrah, migration or flight in Islam. This was, according to the traditions, to escape persecution from the Quraysh of Mecca. Muhammad advised his followers to seek protection in Ethiopia on account that it is a friendly country, and one of the female refugees who later became a wife of Muhammad is reported to have said, "When we reached Abyssinia, the Negus, the king, gave us a kind reception. We safely practiced our religion and we worshipped God and suffered no wrong in word or deed." In other words, Black Africa provided a safe haven for persecuted Muslims, thereby making a vital contribution to the preservation of nascent Arab Islam. Many writers who refer to this tradition always speak of Christian Abyssinia, in a bid to stress the Christian aspect of Ethiopia at the time. The Christian aspect of Ethiopian heritage at the time was no doubt an important contributory factor in motivating the Prophet of Islam to advise his persecuted followers to seek asylum there. Having said that, it is our suggestion, indeed contention, that the goodwill and hospitality accorded persecuted nascent Islam is attributable to the indigenous African tradition of enclavement on the one hand, and the inclusiveness of the indigenous environment on the other. Even though we do not dispute the profound impact of the Christian tradition in Ethiopia at the time, so indigenized were and still are its ritual practices that it was declared a heathen land by European missionaries who went out to convert it in the 18th and 19th centuries. In suggesting that the tolerance and accommodation accorded nascent Islam is attributable to the inherent inclusiveness of the indigenous environment, we do not necessarily imply or suggest that Christianity is inherently intolerant. The historical fact, though, is that Christendom, especially Western Christianity in power, has been anything but tolerant. The indigenous African tradition of enclavement formed the basis of a client-patron and stranger-host relationship between dispersed Muslim communities and their largely traditional host communities throughout most of Black Africa. The tradition derives from a general custom whereby the first settlers on a land enter into a steward-owner relationship with the earth god or goddess or spirit. The earth god or goddess is believed to be the owner of the land, including all natural objects such as trees, minerals, rocks, etc. on it, while the first settlers become the stewards of the land. Writing on traditional Birom and Kilba beliefs on land ownership in northern Nigeria, Lisa Rasmussen observes that land is considered as a sacred trust, a gift from the community or ancestors, and land rights originated from sanctified ancestors or gods. In most cases, while as stewards, first settlers can sell natural objects such as trees of economic value or minerals, they cannot sell the land. First settlers reserve the right of land custodianship, and all later settlers are expected to settle and cultivate the land as guests of the first settlers. The first settlers then act as hosts or patrons to later settlers, who are almost always regarded as strangers. Patronage to non-kin groups was a traditional African requirement, which in turn assured the survival of and safeguarded interest of non-kin or stranger groups in general. As has been intimated in the preceding section, Muslim groups settled in tropical Africa not as a result of any military conquest, but largely, if not solely, as dispersed professionals, i.e., traders, artisans, pastoralists, and religious professionals. These communities did not disperse as whole ethnic or tribal units, but as individuals, and only occasionally as family units. The first priority of these dispersed Muslim minorities was, therefore, to guarantee their lives and wares, a guarantee they could not afford by themselves for obvious reasons. Muslim traders in particular needed protection from banditry, safe passage through potentially hostile lands, and patronage for the promotion of their business interests. Traditional rulers among the more centralized societies and kingdoms, and influential families and individuals among the less centralized communities, by and large provided the patronage under the tradition of enclavement. This explains why, as we intimated in the first part of this chapter, dispersed Muslim groups across tropical Africa tended to settle around areas of political authority. It is from these settlements that the concept of zongo, strangers' quarters, emerged in most parts of East and West Africa. Some of these stranger quarters developed into big cities like Mombasa in Kenya, Bobo Dioulasso in Burkina Faso, and a host of other smaller towns. Early Arab and Persian Muslim traders in East Africa sought patronage and protection from indigenous rulers against the Sofali, Beja, Ganda, Nyamwezi, and Yao. According to T.O. Biederman, Arab traders appear to have found the larger and more effective political systems of the Nyamwezi and the Central Lakes region to be admirably organized for their trading activities. Similarly, P.J.A. Rigby, writing on the Gogo people of Tanzania, describes the trade routes that pass through Ugogo as considered hostile by all travelers, and observes that relations between the Muslim traders and the Gogo were mainly concerned with the right of passage through Ugogo and the provision of supplies for the caravans. Other observers, writing as late as 1860 about Arab traders in the interior enclaves of East Africa, appeared amazed that the Arabs now depend for existence there, Nyamwezi land, not upon prestige, but sufferance, in consideration of mutual commercial advantages. In the same way, founders of Muslim religious settlements, Jama'at, in Somaliland were initially adopted into various clans and tribes by means of clientele, having to accept the inferior status of a client, bound to observe the obligations of a tribesman, and subservient to chiefs and elders. The principle of patronage was also widespread in the Western Sudan. As early as the mid-11th century, Muslim groups in ancient Ghana lived in separate quarters, like the Zogos of modern Ghana, under the auspices of the traditional ruler. One such ruler was praised for his love of justice and generosity toward the Muslims. He had a mosque near his court where Muslims prayed when they called upon him. This tradition continued among such African kingdoms as Bornu, Jolof, Mandinka, Bambara, Mosi, Hausa, Mamprusi, Dagomba, Jonga, Ashanti, etc. A traditional elder of the Birom tribe of northern Nigeria relayed the following typical example of how strangers, and in this case dispersed Hausa Muslim traders, were received through the tradition of enclavement. A few Hausa men came to the chief and asked him for a place to live. The chief led them to a certain place where, he said, they could build their houses. But first, the Sakin Safi, or traditional land priest, performed a ritual of purification in the ground, and it was declared that from that time forward, no Birom should live on this foreign land or even plant a farm on it. The traditional mechanism of enclavement allowed non-kin Muslim communities and other artisans and their religious professionals to acquire land for settlement and to transact their activities relatively peacefully within largely indigenous traditional societies. In what is now modern-day Gambia, Mandingo rulers played host to stranger groups like the Fulani in their various dialect groups, the Wolof, the Diula, and the Serakule. Alien and non-kin groups were generally received and in most cases allowed to live in fairly autonomous settlements as long as they recognized the traditional authority and posed no threat to it. Muslim communities for their part accepted the system and lived, traded and practiced their religion relatively peacefully among the overwhelming non-Muslim host indigenous communities. Muslim settlements in most parts of Black Africa, therefore, in the words of J.S. Trimmingham, represented islands of Islam in a sea of paganism. Some scholars have suggested that the patronage given to Muslim communities by traditional rulers amounted to reducing the former to the status of dhimmi, protected minorities, and therefore was a contravention of the Sharia, which does not permit Muslims to live as dhimmis under a non-Islamic system. Leaving aside the fact that this theory is advanced to justify the jihad movements, the meaning of dhimmi in the old African context needs some qualification since the concept is alien to traditional Africa. If by dhimmis what is meant is that Muslim groups were protected minorities, as the literal meaning of the word stands, then there can be hardly any dispute of its applicability in the African context. For, as we have stated above, Muslims were at this stage, by and large, non-kin minorities who sought patronage and protection from already settled majority indigenous communities. However, if by dhimmis it is meant that Muslim communities were regarded as a sort of second-class citizen with specific discriminatory regulations aimed at them, as some spokesmen of the jihadist tradition would have us believe, then the suggestion is part of post-jihad apologia to justify 18th and 19th century Muslim militancy, mainly in Western Sudan. Contrary to claims that Muslim minorities were oppressed and discriminated against, J.S. Trimmingham makes a lucid observation of the traditional system with regard to the status of subjects within the body politic of traditional Africa as follows. In the same way as each individual had his status in the family defined according to age, sex, and filiation, so in the state, each lineage had its hereditary status and role according to occupation. In other words, non-kin Muslim groups, who were invariably regarded as of a different lineage from the wider indigenous communities, had their status and heritage safeguarded under the body politic of traditional Africa. In this way, Arab Islam was preserved under the traditional system. Apart from the fact that within the traditional system different lineage groups, including Muslim, had their rightful places, early Muslim communities were by and large accorded a specially favored status, not shared even by the masses of the indigenous society. Muslim groups were generally regarded as second only to the ruling classes throughout most of traditional Black Africa. This had to do with the fact that literacy expertise of the Muslim divines became invested with a supernatural power, particularly where writing is primarily a religious activity. This special technological enterprise, i.e. writing, the alphabet, pens, ink, paper, earned Muslim religious men high esteem and reverence in the wider society. The traders, on the other hand, were welcomed and held in high esteem because of their wares such as salt, cloth, etc. In addition to this, traditional African respect and homage to religious objects and personalities as sacred were extended to Muslims, and their lives were regarded in most traditional societies as inviolable. Early European visitors were generally amazed at the way non-kin Muslim minority groups enjoyed peaceful and prosperous status within indigenous communities despite their numerical vulnerability. Writing about the status of the Diula in the midst of traditional Bambara society, a 19th century European visitor was astonished that the Bambara, owing to their superiority of numbers, could molest them, the Diula, if they choose, yet they refrain from doing so, and go to their villages to sell them the superfluous produce of their harvest. Similarly, J. Dupuy, the British consul to Ashanti in 1818, wrote that the Ashanti population venerated Muslims in Kumasi as demigods and look for an increase of wealth in proportion as they compete in tendering respect and offers to service their visitors. Dupuy even claims that throughout a journey, the Muslim seldom disperses a miskel of gold or cowries, the value of 10 shillings, but, on the contrary, is frequently a gainer by the generosity of princes, and his daily wants are moreover liberally supplied at their expenses, and oftentimes with unbounded hospitality. From the above examples, it can be said that if Muslims were protected minorities, dhimmis, at all, as they certainly were in the literal sense of the word, then they were, by and large, favored rather than oppressed minorities. Having said that, one has to guard against romanticizing or overstating the inherent hospitality of the indigenous environment toward non-kin groups in general and Muslim minorities in particular. To give the impression that indigenous hospitality was slavishly accorded to Muslim groups regardless can be misleading. A related romanticism that needs to be guarded against is the impression that Muslim groups were accorded a favorable protected minority status because of the spontaneous appeal of their unique Islamic identity. Suleiman Yang falls into this trap of romanticism when he claims that indigenous people welcome Muslim groups because the former were very impressed by the religious devotion of the merchants, who most likely stopped their business transactions to engage in the prescribed 5 daily prayers. Real and significant as the inherent inclusiveness and openness of the indigenous environment and the socio-religious esteem for Muslim groups were in the relationship, overstating one or the other risks losing sight of the crucial art of pragmatism, which was the watchword on both sides. It is said, for instance, that Nana Osei Kwame, King of Ashanti, 1777 to 1804, was dethroned because of what the elders saw as his unguarded enthusiasm toward the Muslim tradition, which was viewed as a potential threat to the traditional system. Starting from about the 16th century, the Mossi, to take another example, had the Yas, a Monday Muslim trading group, settled in separate communities throughout the kingdom and had imams at their courts who had significant influence over the rulers. The flirtation of the Mossi rulers with the Islamic tradition ranged from using the services of Muslim divines to conversion to Islam. The tension of striking a balance between the traditional system and the Islamic tradition remained evident, as one Mossi ruler is said to have sent away his heir apparent for being too favorable to Islam and deposed a sub-chief for the same reason. So delicate was the relationship that even the most devoted Muslim Mossi ruler, Moro Naba Kutu, sent most of his sons to Quranic schools except his firstborn, the heir apparent. Muslims also had their own dilemmas, which culminated in the jihad movements in the 18th and 19th centuries, as will become apparent in Chapter 3. It is the ramifications of the relationship as they relate to the preservation and propagation of Islam that we now proceed to highlight. The socio-religious dynamics. The implications of the status of non-kin Muslim minorities in the midst of overwhelming non-Muslim societies were profound and complicated for both parties. Muslim minorities, on their part, were caught between the desire to preserve their identity and status, which, thanks to Islam, distinguished them from the majority indigenous communities they live with, and the universal missionary imperatives of sharing Islam with the wider community. The apprehension that minority groups had of losing their distinctive identity, which Islam accorded them, was not just theoretical and unfounded, but real. There have been instances in some parts of northern Ghana and Togo whereby Muslim groups underwent a cultural assimilation, losing their distinctive Islamic identity and turning their praying grounds into shrines where sacrifices were made to invoke the aid of the Muslim god. In an apparent self-protectionist endeavor, therefore, Islam among early dispersed Muslim communities, Arab, Swahili, Moor, Diula, Fulani, Hausa, etc., in tropical Africa was jealously guarded as a divinely sanctioned social and cultural entity that was not to be open to or shared with others. Among the Diula Islam was a Diula way of life. As observed, the question, "Are you Muslim?" was always translated, "Are you Diula?" Thus, The distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim corresponded to that of the divide between Dayula and non-Dayula. This made it difficult for both the Dayula Muslim to share Islam with the non-Dayula and for the non-Dayula to adopt Islam. An early colonial administrator in Kohogo, in the Ivory Coast, relates the following anecdote, which reflects the lack of interest in sharing the Islamic tradition among the Dayula. The anecdote has it that once a traditional chief converted to Islam and began to practice the faith with an enthusiasm of a neophyte. The chief's zeal ironically caused some embarrassment to the local Muslim divines. When an epidemic broke out, the Muslim divines reportedly told the chief, "Do not be astonished if the village is subjected to Allah's wrath. He has done well by putting everyone in his place. You have transgressed his orders and have abandoned the faith of your fathers, whom God manifestly commanded to drink palm wine, to eat unclean meat, and to worship only stones, mountains, and trees." In East Africa, Arab, Persian, Shirazi, Swahili, and Asian Muslim groups developed an even greater sense of social distancing from their traditional African neighbors. This had more to do with racial and cultural chauvinism toward the indigenous people than a purely minority syndrome, as in the case of the Dayula in West Africa. Here, Islam came to be closely identified with perceived Arab superiority on the coast and regarded as an ustarabu, i.e., civilization, whereas the indigenous people living in the hinterland were referred to as washenzi, savages. In Tanzania in particular, Muslim traders were specifically known as Valungwana, civilized people, and people had to become Muslim in order to become Valungwana. To share Islam with the washenzi under such circumstances risked compromising the status of Muslims. Thus, the Ibadis are said to have encouraged their African slaves to follow the Shafi legal tradition in order to preserve Ibadiyya as a tribal religion of the Wamanga. Indigenous people who nevertheless converted to Islam were, therefore, by and large treated by immigrant Muslim groups as second-class Muslims. Religious leadership, such as the office of the Imam, became the preserve of immigrant Muslims over indigenous converts to Islam, irrespective of the level of religious education. A situation very reminiscent of the way early Arab Muslims regarded non-Arab Muslims, Mawali. As a result, right up to the 20th century, and in some cases the present day, Arabs and Swahilis would not assume a subordinate religious role to, say, a Yao Muslim in East Africa, or the Moorish before a Wolof in Senegal, a Hausa Fulani before a Yoruba in Nigeria, or a Dayula Hausa before a Mossi, Dangomba, Senufo, Akan, etc., in the Middle Volta Basin. In all those cases, immigrant Muslims are the automatic prayer leaders, more by virtue of their ethnic origins than the level of their religious knowledge. The same is true of the Ahmadiyya movement, founded by Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian in India during the latter part of the 19th century, introduced into Ghana in 1921, whence it spread to other parts of Africa. Despite its professed missionary zeal, for a very long time, Pakistanis monopolized the leadership ranks of the movement in Africa. This monopoly assumed ideological complications during the nationalistic fervor that gripped the continent at the end of the European colonial rule. Ghanaian Ahmadis presented a memorandum to the then head of the Qadiani faction, Mirza Nasir Ahmad, during a visit to Ghana in 1970, in which they expressed the indigenous Ghanaian grievance in the following words: "Since Ahmadiyat is looked upon, though wrongly in this country, as a foreign religious organization, manned only by foreigners, we humbly suggest that this wrong notion be removed by allowing greater participation in the local religious administration by Ghanaians." Affiliation to Sufi orders was also premised along family and kinship lines. Ahmad al-Baka'i al-Kunti of the Kunta condemned one Mohammed Akik of Kelaksuk Zawaya of betrayal for having chosen the Sudanese in preference to the whites, the Fulanis in preference to the people of Al-Suk, because the latter left the Qadiriya, which presumably was regarded as the order of the whites, to join the Tijaniya order of the blacks of Al-Hajj Umar Tal. In Nigeria, it is known that the Tijaniya order is strongly patronized by the Hausa, while the Qadiriya has largely remained the preserve of the Fulani. These developments meant that particular communities already competing against each other on different grounds further demarcated themselves by joining rival Islamic persuasions, thereby further complicating the issue of religious conversion. The strong communal and ethnic bonds as they relate to Islam and the notion of the Muslim Ummah has been commented upon by J.S. Trimingham, who observed that the change brought about by Islam, and Christianity for that matter, in this respect should not be exaggerated. The old basis of community remained paramount, and the ideal of unity of believers a superimposed linkage. The Dayula in particular seem to have recognized the inherent contradiction between the universal claims of Islam and their apparent tribalization and quarantining of the religion. They developed a curious doctrine to the effect that all just men, including non-Muslims, could be admitted to Islam after death and saved eventually in a sort of purgatory called the Tabakoroni. But this compounded rather than alleviated their dilemma. For the Dayula of Kohogo ironically referred to their Senufo neighbors collectively as Banmana, refusers, or those who refused Islam, even though they themselves were anything but keen to convert the non-Dayula. The label refusers, though, reveals two other dilemmas on the part of traditional people. First of all, like the village chief mentioned above, there were those indigenous people who admired Islam and aspired after full conversion, but were literally made to feel uncomfortable and awkward by the attitude of the minority Muslim groups. The second dilemma had to do with converting to Islam, which, in the eyes of indigenous communities, was an aspect of the way of life of a non-kin group, and entailed the implied but real risk of losing one's own identity. Thus, these became refusers. The dilemmas on the part of the indigenous communities with regard to conversion to Islam had to do mainly with the traditional African understanding of religion, whence ensues their perceptions of Muslim and Islam. This is reflected in the way indigenous people refer to Muslim settlements as zongos, strangers' quarters, in the towns or by the ethnic name of the group, such as Yasin, Ya settlement, Musin, Mosi settlement, Wangarasin, Wangara settlement, etc., in some parts of northern Ghana. Muslim groups were, therefore, identified by their ethnicity, followed by their profession, which in most cases was trade, rather than their religion, Islam. Their identity as Muslims was hardly prominent, and where it did appear, it always served more as an adjective than a proper noun. A court official of the paramount chief of the Mosi insisted in an interview that the Yas perform prayers, but they are not believers. They are traders and travelers. The official's confusion here reveals something of the traditional African understanding of religion, namely that religion is not and cannot be institutionalized. Talking about the traditional African understanding of religion, R.E.S. Tanner makes the following perceptive observation. African languages have no equivalent for the Western word religion, or indeed ritual. So in order to consider the religions of Christianity and Islam, they have to start using an alien imported word. Similarly, the practitioners of African traditional religions do not look upon their religious beliefs and practices as a distinct set of activities separated from economic or other ones, nor are they defined as the religions of the Yoruba, Zulu, or Kamba peoples as if they were national churches. An old traditionalist on being asked his religion would reply, "I am a Zulu," or whatever. Consequently, even though Africans are pervasively religious, one cannot talk of religion per se in traditional African terms. In other words, one can talk of religiosity, but not religion, if the former is seen as the awareness and the quest for metaphysical phenomena, while the latter is seen in terms of a codified and institutionalized set of doctrines and ritual practices. The African way of life in every aspect is immersed in religion, so much so that to ask him or her what is religion is like asking, "Who are you?" As a Chinese proverb has put it, if you want a definition of water, do not ask a fish. The only definition of religion to the African, therefore, is that it is indefinable, because the religion of Africa does not live in the pages of books on world religions. Rather, it lives in the hearts and lives of people. As far as the traditional African is concerned, kinship, rather than religion, is what distinguishes one community from another. Muslim groups were seen as any other lineage or clan with their own culture, of which Islam was just a part of the whole. Islam as a way of life, or system of beliefs and practices, was therefore conceived by the wider non-Muslim community in relation to particular ethnic groups. It was hardly seen as an institutionalized, universal system of beliefs and practices meant for everyone to belong. In traditional African thought, therefore, one can speak of religious figures like priestesses rather than religious communities. The term Muslim, in all its variations in the vernaculars, was used to refer to Muslim religious divines in the same sense as traditional priests and priestesses rather than whole communities. In fact, within Muslim groups like the Dayula and the Wolof, the stricter observances of Islamic rituals, such as the liturgical prayers, fasting, etc., were regarded by the ordinary members of the community as binding only on the religious professional class. Thus, while the distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim corresponded to that between Dayula and non-Dayula, among the Dayula in turn, only the Mori, the Dayula variant for Muslim, used to refer to religious scholars, were obligated in principle to follow the strictures of Islamic law diligently. This religious laxity on the part of the majority of ordinary African Muslims and Christians reveals the African perception of religion as specialized but not institutionalized. This perception regards the priest or priestess as those under obligation, in addition to the general observances of the community, to observe the minutest details associated with a particular cult or god or goddess because of his or her special role. The implications of the traditional African understanding of religion are twofold. First of all, it raised a serious barrier for indigenous conversion to Islam. For in a sense, since there are no religious boundaries in traditional thought, there was, in effect, nothing to cross over or convert from. Religion is therefore non-missionary. Also, since Islam was seen by the traditional indigenous person in relation to particular non-kin ethnic groups, the implication was that to become Muslim amounted to changing one's ethnicity. As J.S. Mbiti puts it, a person cannot be converted from one tribal religion to another. He has to be born in the particular society in order to participate in the entire religious life of the people. In this regard, as indigenous Tiv of northern Nigeria observed, anyone who does Salah or Salat is considered a Hausa man. He is no longer accepted as a Tiv. Why then should anyone wish to do it? This is because as far as the Tiv are concerned, Islam is an aspect of Hausa way of life. Contrary, therefore, to claims that Islamization was easy and conversion less of a problem to Africans because Muslim agents were Africans, the non-kinness of the African Muslim groups became a barrier to the adoption of Islam by the wider indigenous communities. Because religion has no defined boundaries, the whole question of religious conversion of individuals per se did not arise, and where it did, it was perceived both by the Muslim group and the wider community in terms other than religious. Among the Wolof in West Africa, it is reported that a person of noble origin converted to Islam at the risk of losing his right of inheritance and married within the nobility, while in East Africa, conversion within some communities was seen as becoming a Swahili, which also warranted losing one's claim of inheritance and land tenure. In fact, as will be made clear in Chapter 3, sudden and mass conversions to Islam in northern Nigeria evoked a sense of unease, apprehension, and hostility from the Hausa ruling elite. One ruler, Nafata, 1794 to 1801, literally imposed a ban on Hausa conversion to Islam, or rather, a particular version of Islam as espoused by the preacher turned jihadist Usman Danfodio, died 1817, and asked all male converts to revert to the traditions of their fathers. Nafata viewed the wearing of turbans and veils, Fulani nomadic dresses in that context, as a challenge to the system he represented and banned their use. These measures, taken to safeguard the traditional Hausa way of life, were in turn seen by Danfodio as religious intolerance and persecution of the Muslim religion, leading to confrontation and jihad. The second implication of the African understanding of religion as non-institutionalized and a non-codified system of beliefs and practices is that people could appropriate religious arts, rituals, and other services without necessarily becoming members of or having to convert to the particular tradition. In other words, there is an implicit openness and inclusiveness in traditional African religiosity that permits the appropriation, and exchanges of ideas and rituals at the individual and communal level without one having to change one's religion. As J.S. Mbiti puts it, as with material culture, religious ideas and activities are exchanged when people come into contact with one another. This exchange of ideas is spontaneous and is probably more noticeable in practical matters like rainmaking, combating magic and witchcraft, and dealing with misfortunes. Thus, while one could not participate as a member of a religious system, since there is nothing like a religious system anyway, one could be a client or a customer to any religious services. Conversion, in the traditional African understanding of religion, was therefore more a matter of the freedom of appropriating religious rituals, arts and services for personal or communal use than the crossing over of persons from one religion to another. Thus, ironically, the strength and appeal of Islam manifested in the high demand for Islamic religious elements was equally the main debilitating factor in the adoption of Islam as an institutionalized system or way of life. It is within this context that our earlier intimation that Muslim religious arts of divination, charms and amulets were to combine their traditional cultural and religious customs with Arab Islamic and Western Christian ones. The eclectic religious cosmology of traditional Africa and the consequent inclusive religiosity of Africans meant that most African Muslims could go for Christian religious arts and services and vice versa, or continue to dabble in traditional African religious elements. This eclectic perception of religion was bound to pose a serious challenge to Islam and Christianity with their abrupt and exclusive doctrinal claims. Over the years, African Christian and Muslim Puritans have expressed concern and open hostility to this phenomenon, describing the inclusive religiosity as nominalism, lack of faith, or incomplete conversion, descriptions that reveal a lack of appreciation of African religiosity. Indeed, as far as the so-called nominal Muslims and Christians are concerned, trying and experimenting with other traditions is an expression of deep religiosity. To use the words of A. Berinyu, it is not a question of lack of faith or unconversion. It is a question of who can do what and when. The query might be raised as to what then happens to truth. The traditional African's response to such a query is that truth, insofar as it relates to religious matters, is functional. Religious truth is not a set of doctrinal or creedal statements meant to be logically argued and proven. The resultant configuration of the interaction between Black African heritage and its Arab Islamic counterpart within the eclectic traditional African religious environment has been described in rather derogatory and unfavorable terms by different observers. In general, contemporary Western observers refer to it as African Islam, Islam Noir, popular Islam, mixed Islam, etc. And still in most cases remain, at best, indirect means of conversion to Islam should be understood. The spread of Islam as an institutionalized system of beliefs and practices or as a way of life was not, therefore, only neutralized by the traditional African perception of religion, but where Islam was adopted, it meant a blending with, rather than a complete breakaway from, indigenous practices. Consequently, African Muslim and Christian groups and individuals throughout the continent continue, after centuries of conversion, in contradistinction to what these writers perceive as orthodox Islam, normative Islam, or pure Islam. We shall examine the notion of pure, orthodox, or normative Islam, and what precisely is meant by religious contamination in Chapter 5. However, the point to be noted here is that one of the main reasons advanced to justify military jihad as a religious duty in Black Africa by its advocates was the same notion of contaminating Islam with traditional African religious and customary elements, as will be elaborated in Chapter 3. In other words, the 18th and 19th century jihad movements of West Africa were a direct response or reaction to the African tradition of inclusive religiosity, which the jihadists regarded as a threat to orthodox and pure Islam. A curious aspect of the inclusive religiosity of indigenous Africa that has fascinated some observers in relation to conversion to Islam has to do with situations in which non-Muslims are said to pledge unborn children to be born as Muslims. This normally happens in cases when a woman has her children persistently dying soon after birth or barrenness. In some cases, the misfortune could be ill health. Among the Mossi of Burkina Faso, for example, the misfortunes relating to childbirth among non-Muslim women may be treated by divinatory diagnosis that the would-be children are refusing to be or are prevented from birth or survival except as Muslims. In this case, the remedy is for the would-be child to be born Muslim. Among the Giriama of Kenya, to take another example, people suffering from some chronic illness may be diagnosed as having been possessed by Muslim spirits, for which the cure is, once again, conversion to Islam. In fact, these practices are very common among the Kusasi of northeastern Ghana and other Mule Dagbani people groups of the Middle Volta Basin of West Africa. The fascination here, in the context of Muslim and Christian competitive triumphalism and expansionism, is the way in which traditional religions apparently conspire against their own interest. First of all, the question that needs to be addressed is the rationale behind the phenomenon as far as the people involved are concerned. In other words, why do traditional African people pledge unborn children to be born as Muslims? The first point to bear in mind is that the practice no doubt ensues from the inherent openness and inclusive religiosity in indigenous traditions, which encourages experimentation with all religious phenomena as discussed above. This religious eclecticism, as alluded to above, does not mean competition and therefore superiority and inferiority on the part of any tradition. It is a question of which particular spirit, god, medium, cult, or tradition is associated with what functions. The second point is that the practice was an age-old custom within such societies long before the Muslim presence and is still widespread amongst the Kusasi and other people groups of northeastern Ghana. Here, unborn children are pledged to particular deities, the most famous known as Gunab in northern Togo. Such children, when born, are taken to the god and made to observe certain dietary and other restrictions. The pledging of unborn children to the Muslim deity, therefore, is done alongside those of other African divinities and cults. The same is true of ill health, especially mental or psychiatric disorders. The third point is that these misfortunes are understood as having various causes, among which are the following. First, when a woman experiences the death of her children soon after birth, for instance, the belief is that the necessary inquiries and provision for the child's sojourn in this world have not been adequately carried out. For example, all children are believed to come with their destinies, which include special vocations. Thus, some children may be born to serve specific deities, in which case the deity must be identified and the necessary provision in terms of sacrifices and items needed for the vocation, such as special uniforms, made in advance. Without these, it is believed the child will return or die soon after it arrives or is born. In addition, the child is made to observe dietary and other restrictions as it relates to the deity in question. Hence, when a diviner indicates that a soon-to-be-born child is destined to be Muslim, a belief that must have been influenced by the Muslim presence, then alms will be offered to a Muslim religious divine. And then upon birth, the child is given a Muslim name and circumcised. A Muslim prayer circle is erected in the compound, and the child is made to observe Islamic dietary restrictions. Second, when in such misfortunes as infant mortality, the sex of the children happens to be the same 2 or 3 consecutive times, the belief is that it is the same child who keeps coming and going because of a struggle between the living and ancestral worlds for the child's custody. Some of the ways to outwit the ancestral world include pledging the child to a strange deity, thereby spiritually excommunicating the unborn child out of the kin group, which includes the ancestral world. The Kusasi call this Zambaan, which means pegging. Thus, in actual fact, pledging could be slightly misleading. This excommunication or pegging is believed to discourage or prevent the ancestors from coming for the child, since he or she is no longer kin. Another way is to give the child a horrible name at birth, such as I am thou for males and I am poak for females, meaning male and female slave respectively amongst the Kusasi. Yet another way is to disfigure or disguise the child by giving it particular facial marks. In all these, the belief is to make the child less attractive or recognizable by the ancestral spirits. In cases where children are pegged to the Muslim deity, they are simply given names like Amor, Muslim, Ayarig or Asimig, denoting Yas and Fulani, both Muslim groups respectively. The main point that needs to be borne in mind here is that pegging unborn children to the Muslim deity or converting to Islam to avert a misfortune is just one of the many remedies in non-Muslim African societies. Even more significantly, instances of actual conversion to Islam to remedy a misfortune are as rare as they are curious. Rarely do such individuals, especially children, grow up as practicing Muslims beyond having the Muslim name. The fact that any one such child may be called Muhammad does not mean that they share the Muslim faith in reality, just as those who are called Ayarig or Asimig do not belong to the Yas or Fulani ethnic group in reality. Speaking from experience of what pertains amongst the Mule Dagbani people groups, of which the Mosi are a part, in general, and the Kusasi in particular, whose traditions, customs, and worldviews the writer knows and shares, in actual practice, most, if not all children pegged to the Muslim god grow up in the traditions of their non-Muslim parents. This is mainly because of the non-Muslim environment in which such children are brought up. Therefore, to speak of the practice as an effective technique for gaining converts to Islam is misleading. Conversion to Islam and Christianity in tropical Africa is therefore ambiguous, not only because of the very subjective nature of conversion itself, but because of how religion is perceived in traditional African terms. Conversion was not a simple matter of people coming to a better or fuller awareness and experience of the Supreme Being, systematically set out in doctrinal or creedal formulae. Lamine Sané makes this point well. Conversion or resistance to belief is not, at least initially, a matter of verbal debate, but of social custom and convention expressed in such things as dietary and sartorial habits, ritual taboos, and ethnic and residential identity. Even in the doctrine of Tawhid, of prescribed belief in the divine unity, is transmitted within the indigenous mythological code of belief in the supernatural and ethical system based on it, rather than by philosophical disputation, as in Avicenna's or Al-Ghazali's treatises. J. S. Trimmingham's observation about conversion to Christianity in particular, and religious change in general within the West African context are very instructive. After acknowledging that direct evangelistic work has had little impact in the conversion of masses of people to Christianity throughout its whole history, Trimmingham was struck by the fact that spiritual motives played little part in the religious change in West Africa. He declares, "Most people join Christianity and Islam from what we call secondary motives. It seems to be a fact that religions have little chance of spreading upon their own merit. Freedom of choice is rarely involved in change of religion. Conversions in general take place not because of new insight into reality, but are determined by factors over which most people have no control. These factors are the socio-political considerations in conversion within traditional African society, and this needs to be taken into account. This is particularly important in talking about conversion to Islam in Africa because we are dealing with religious changes and exchanges that took place largely within politically structured systems, i.e., the centralized societies in which dispersed Muslim communities sought and were generally given patronage. For as rightly observed by David Owusu Ansah, the decision to allow or control the peaceful process of conversion to Islam and Christianity in a centralized African kingdom was a political one and needs to be given that proper treatment. It is this socio-political dimension of religious change that we now proceed to examine. The socio-political dynamics. The trickiest aspect of the stranger-host, client-patron relationship between Muslim and non-Muslim indigenous communities was in the socio-political arena. This has to do with the traditional system of land tenure, briefly referred to above, which is inextricably linked to the office of chief, in more centralized societies as opposed to less centralized societies. The chief holds the land in trust for the community and must always come from a recognized royal lineage, i.e., the first settlers. He is, therefore, not just a political head, but successor to the ancestors and representative of both the living and the living dead, J.S. Mbiti's term for ancestors. As such, an African ruler is not to his people merely a person who can enforce his will on them. He is the axis of their political relations, the symbol of their unity and exclusiveness, and the embodiment of their essential values. His credentials are mystical and are derived from antiquity. Rulers drew their political authority from this system and were therefore obliged to maintain the traditional order with its religious and ritual paraphernalia. As K.A. Busia put it, no one could be an adequate chief in Ashanti who did not perform the ritual functions of his office. It is as successors of the ancestors that they are venerated and their authority respected, and they could not keep the office without maintaining contact with the ancestors through the traditional rituals. There are some implications associated with the traditional land tenure. First of all, it meant that non-kin Muslim communities, like all other non-kin groups, were given usufructory rights to settle and cultivate, but not to own and sell land. In this regard, it has been pointed out that in Senegambia, the term Soninke came to be identified with the aristocratic class of landowners and rulers, and the term Marabout came to be associated with the Muslim stranger who had no land ownership rights. This is due to the fact that, as Lisa Rasmussen summarizes within the context of northern Nigeria, traditional attitudes toward land ownership are as follows. 1. Rights in land were vested in the community. 2. Rights in occupancy depended upon residents within the community. 3. The community, represented by the chief, exercised the control, occupation, and use of land. 4. Land could not be alienated by sale, but only transferred through inheritance, gift, or temporary loan. Even in areas where Muslims wrested political power by dint of arms from the traditional rulers in Senegambia, Mervyn Hiskett observes that the issue of land ownership, changing from being traditional to Sharia-based, was largely theoretical, for the traditional owners were left in possession provided they co-opted with the Islamic State. In Somalia, a Muslim religious leader is reported to have said, "The land is not ours, and if the Sidle, the host tribe, desire, they can take it away because they have only adopted us." Chiefs, sub-chiefs, and elders of the host indigenous communities have the right to sell natural objects of economic value on the land and to collect land taxes. Stranger groups are not allowed under any circumstance to do any of these. A traditional Ashanti man informed K.A. Busia in 1946 thus, "The plantains and cocoa yams you plant are yours. The land is the chief's. You cannot sell the land. You may mortgage your kola. Only the stool, i.e. the chief and his elders, can sell land. When a stranger buys the land, he buys the surface, that is, the right to use it." The second and most crucial implication of the traditional system is that non-kin groups could not become chiefs. Even though Muslims enjoyed special favors from the ruling classes, they, like all other non-kin groups, were allowed to act as leaders of their own communities and to represent them at the traditional court. Their leadership within the communities related to such matters as business affairs, contract signatories, and inheritance. As subjects, Muslim groups shared the civic responsibilities of all subjects in general and non-kin groups in particular toward the system, i.e. to render services and pay levies in cash and kind to the traditional courts. To use the words of the traditional Ashanti man once again, "In the old days, everyone who lived on your land was your subject, and so he accompanied you and fought in your wars. Every year, the chief claims money from him if he has cocoa. If he has no cocoa, he provides a sheep for the stool." Tariffs, known as Sehale in Bambara and Hongo in some parts in East Africa, were levied on Muslim traders as transit fees, and the land tax known as Jangali in Hausaland and Liu in some parts of Senegambia were levied on non-kin settler communities, including Muslim. In most cases, however, Muslims were generally exempted from active participation in war, and throughout tropical Africa were always distinguished from the warrior group, who are almost always the ruling class. This was the case in the Marabout Soninke divide of the Senegambia and the Daiola Sonongui divide of Kong in present-day Ivory Coast. The Sonongui are said to have recognized the right of the Daiola to refrain from fighting on religious grounds. Similarly, it is reported that in northern Ghana, during a civil war in Salaga in the 19th century, militant Hausa Muslims offered to join one faction only to be ordered home by the chief because fighting was the business of chiefs, not of Muslims. Related to the Muslim warrior ruling class divide is the separation between religion, din, on the one hand, and politics, dawla, seen as worldly and secular, dunya, on the other, as incompatible by some Muslim groups. Philip Curtin has suggested that this stance fitted the interest of minority Muslim groups in Africa who use religious prestige to buy a degree of autonomy from secular control, building up a reputation for neutrality in times of war. Lamine Sané, in his part, maintains that the repudiation of war and political neutrality was an ideological rather than strategic position within the Janhanke communities, thanks to the teachings of Al-Hajj Salim Suare. It should be said, though, that the emphasis on a principled and consistent political neutrality of the Jahanke implies that the Jahanke were in a position to take political power but declined on matters of principle. Although some individual Muslims did decline offers of political offices, in the light of the status of Muslim groups as non-kin minorities delineated so far, such an emphasis risked losing sight of the various traditional mechanisms that were in effect employed to keep non-kin and alien groups out of the political arena, as we shall shortly demonstrate. Also, the emphasis on Jahanke pacifism as a consistent ideological principle fails to explain why leading members of the tradition initiated and took part in military jihad during the 19th century, albeit for a limited time. This is not to suggest that all Muslims were potential usurpers. What we are saying is that room should be left for pragmatism and indeed opportunism on both sides when talking about the relations between non-kin Muslim minorities living under the patronage of overwhelming indigenous non-Muslim communities. Otherwise, the different dilemmas and tensions faced by both parties in the relations can easily be overlooked. Muslim relations to and influence in traditional courts was, nevertheless, institutionalized and in some cases quite significant. In Gonjaland of northern Ghana, officiating Muslim divines reminded chiefs during enskinment ceremonies that malams were to the chief as his wives. This proverbial statement has a double-edged meaning. First, it confirms the favored position accorded Muslim divines within the traditional system. Malams should be treated by the chief as his wives. A particular group of Muslims in Gonjaland, called the Dogtes, shared the chief's food, came before him without prostrating or removing footwear, and could sit on the royal skin, privileges not enjoyed by sub-chiefs or the chief's sons. It also reminded the chief of his responsibility toward the Muslim to provide him with such material things as he would his wives. This included being gentle and considerate and not harsh with Muslims. The second meaning is a reminder to the Muslim that he is a wife and not a son who should rival the chief for his office. Like all wives in the traditional sense, Muslims were expected to take the back seat and exert their influence from there. This principle was applied throughout most of tropical Africa in different ways, and as the English adage has it, behind every successful man there is a woman. So it can be said, behind every successful traditional ruler in Africa there was a Muslim. This arrangement, while ensuring the protection and indeed favored position of Muslims in general as non-kin members of the wider society, effectively circumscribed Muslim direct participation in political affairs, or so traditional rulers thought. But, as alluded to above, Muslim influence on rulers and the traditional courts was more than apparent. European travelers to late 19th and early 20th century present-day Burkina Faso, for example, talk of the influence imams had on chiefs. In one particular case, one traveler remarked that, as a counselor of the chief, the imam is overtly acknowledged as the second official in the village, but in reality, he often commanded it. There were two ways in which Muslims could become chiefs. One was through the conversion of a regent, or heir apparent, and the other through the marriage from the royal line, especially in matrilineal societies where the offspring could be eligible for the office of chief. These did happen, especially among the Beja, but in such cases, the chiefs then had to strike a balance between the demands of Islam and those of the traditional indigenous system, a difficult balance that, almost always, tilted in favor of the latter. The implication of the monopoly of political power through the office of the chief, coupled with the eclectic nature of traditional religious thought, meant that the indigenous environment enjoyed the privilege of being in a position to select those aspects of the Arab Islamic dispensation it found useful. In the selection, elements alien to the local genius were rejected, and those adopted were molded into conformity. The discriminatory and selective borrowing was most manifest in the fact that throughout most of tropical Africa, the wider indigenous non-Muslim communities in general, and the ruling classes in particular, while very enthusiastic about the ritual content of Islam, showed little if any interest in its legal and political content. In other words, the socio-political and legal prescription of Islam were regarded as incompatible with and detrimental to the indigenous systems. Thus it could be said that traditional African cultures have intrinsic resources of adaptability and discernment that they can take from Islam or from Christianity, what agrees with their values, rejecting or radically modifying other elements that conflict. Some rulers, like those of Ashanti, employed the services of Muslims in their courts but hardly adopted Muslim names or performed the Salat. Others, like those of Mali, Songhai, Hausa, Bornu, Bambara, Dagomba, etc., adopted Muslim names, ways of dressing, and performed the Salat, but were less keen on its legal and political content. Related to this is that since, generally speaking, rulers hardly sought to espouse Islam as a state policy, the vast majority of the wider indigenous societies remained non-Muslim. This was due to the conception of rulership or dominion in traditional African political thought. As J.S. Trimmingham perceptibly points out, dominion in traditional African political thought is a reverse of an imperium, if by that is meant a dominium, which seeks to extend its form of civilization over diverse societies. The ruler, Trimmingham observed, was not interested in dominating territory as such, but in relationship with social groups upon whom he could draw to provide levies in time of war, servants for his court, and cultivators to keep his granaries full. Hence, contrary to claims that the non-literate traditions of Africa cannot enter into a creative and resilient pluralism, they have proven to have an inbuilt mechanism that fostered the adoption of Islam by individual lineages, even the powerful ruling classes, without affecting the rest of society. David Owusu Ansah, in analyzing the Ashanti attitude to Islam, also concluded that even though Islamic charms and amulets were sought and deeply desired for war purposes, the Asante rulers clearly saw that a strong Muslim presence, if not selectively controlled, was incompatible with the preservation of the traditional culture upon which their power rested, because Islamization calls for adjustments in local culture, changes that are likely to affect the structure of political power. The tradition of enclavement, made possible by the socio-religious and political inclusiveness of the indigenous environment on the one hand, ensured the preservation and cultivation of Arab Islam in tropical Africa, while on the other hand, the pragmatic and discerning attitude toward the appropriation of Islamic elements ensured that traditional values were not surrendered in the process. Consequently, as in the 17th century, about after 7 centuries of Islam in tropical Africa, the Islamic dispensation remained the class religion of the mercantile bourgeois and religious elite, and an additional royal cult in centralized African societies. It is this situation that J.S. Trimmingham referred to as the stagnation of Islam in tropical Africa. In stating this fact, we are by no means suggesting that Islam made little or no impact whatsoever on African societies. Islam definitely made an indelible impact, both on Muslim and non-Muslim African communities in their socio-religious and political lives and institutions. This is an incontrovertible fact, well attested at times with exaggerations in many post-colonial writings on Islam in Africa. The point we are making here, though, is that it was mainly as accommodated, tolerated, and favored guests within indigenous Africa that Muslims exerted their influence and made their contributions. So in a sense, the exchanges and influences were mutual. Conclusion. We have tried to establish 3 basic points in this chapter. First, we have shown that Islam was introduced into tropical Africa not by an invading army, as happened in other parts of the Muslim world, but by dispersed Muslim professionals, i.e. traders and religious divines. We have intimated that neither of these groups of Muslims were missionaries, and that conversion associated with their activities were in the main indirect and as such byproducts, albeit effective byproducts. The second point we sought to highlight is that Muslim groups were, generally speaking, non-kin groups under non-Muslim African patronage. Our main aim in highlighting the non-kinness of the largely dispersed Muslim groups in their relations with the indigenous traditional communities in tropical Africa is to bring out the pragmatic accommodation and preservation of Arab Islam within the traditional African environment. In this regard, our conclusion is that traditional religions were on the whole favorably disposed towards the presence of Muslims, and Christians for that matter, in their midst, without prejudicing their own interest. Thus we sought to challenge impressions that the non-literate indigenous traditions were weak and passive objects of change determined by the literate tradition of Islam. Indeed, after describing African culture as a passive factor, J.S. Trimmingham went on to admit that when assimilation took place between African and Islamic institutions, the basic institution into which the other was assimilated might be either, but was generally the African. Trimmingham even went further to state that it is incorrect to talk about the adaptation of Islam to African. African Muslims, Trimmingham explains, did not so much adapt Islam, a legalistic religion, as secure the acceptance of certain Islamic customs in such a way that the customary framework of society remained intact. We also demonstrated that the eclectic and open nature of traditional African religious thought was by no means evasive and syncretistic, and that it fostered a creative and resilient pluralism. Thus, the traditional order fostered the preservation and indeed propagation of Arab Islam without prejudice to its own value systems. This state of affairs, as far as some Muslims were concerned, meant that the preaching jihad was an ineffective method of propagating Islam in Africa. Hence, jihad of the sword had to be resorted to. This is the subject of the next chapter.